Chapter 3 Berkeley Square and Red Lion Square. No alleged haunting caused greater interest and sensation in the 70s and 80s of the last century than that of No. Berkeley Square. When I first visited London, as a schoolboy, in the early 90s, I soon found my way to Berkeley Square, and although No. was no longer a prominent topic of conversation, it having long since lost its excessive notoriety, I was, nevertheless, thrilled when I caught a glimpse of it. Then few people questioned the truth of its once having been really haunted. The stories told about it were generally accepted as facts, and not, as what many people now consider them, fabrications. There is still much diversity of opinion as to the origin of the reports of the hauntings. Some think they arose from the fact that the house was for some time occupied by a very eccentric hypochondriac, who shut himself up there and saw no one, inhabiting one room only and letting the other rooms go to rack and ruin. Sometimes he wandered around them at night, a lighted candle in his hand, and this, it was surmised, led his neighbors and people passing by to believe that the premises were haunted. Moreover, as the recluse was tall and haggard, the fitful light from the candle, accentuating his pallor, made him appear eerie and spectre-like, and thus it may have been that the report got about that the house was haunted by a very terrible-looking apparition. Other skeptics with regard to the superphysical were of the opinion that the story of the hauntings was merely an invention on the part of some caretaker, who wanted to prevent people, by scaring them, from buying or renting the house, in order that he, or she, might go on living there. Allusion to this house was made by well-known contemporary authors, and might be found both in books and articles. Lord Lyttelton, for instance, writing of it in Notes and Queries once said, "It is quite true that there is a house in Berkeley Square said to be haunted, and long unoccupied on that account. There are strange stories about it, into which this deponent cannot enter," and the author of an interesting article on ghostly happenings in the now defunct Mayfair ** Society magazine, writes, "The house in Berkeley Square contains at least one room of which the atmosphere is supernaturally fatal to body and mind alike. A girl saw, heard, and felt such horror in it that she went mad, and never recovered sanity enough to tell how or why. 3 A gentleman, a disbeliever in ghosts, dared to sleep in it, and was found a corpse in the middle of the floor, after frantically ringing for help in vain. Rumors suggest other cases of the same kind, all ending in death, madness, or both, as the result of sleeping, or trying to sleep, in that room. The very party walls of the house, when touched, are found saturated with electric horror. It is uninhabited, save by an elderly man and woman, who act as caretakers, but even these have no access to the room. That is kept locked, the key being in the hands of a mysterious and seemingly nameless person, who comes to the house once every 6 months, locks up the elderly people in the basement, and then unlocks the room and occupies himself in it for hours." Bulwer Lytton introduces the house into at least one of his stories. Whether it was really haunted or not I cannot say. As I remarked before, its notoriety was much on the wane the first time I saw it, and I have never crossed its threshold. During a nocturnal vigil in a haunted house, near Bristol, the late Lord Curzon of Kettleston assured me No. Berkeley Square never was haunted. He said the stories relating to it were pure inventions, and I understood him to say, too, that the house had, at one time, belonged to a relative of his, who, in consequence of the sinister rumors about it, had caused it to be demolished and rebuilt. The original building may, or may not, I think, have harbored beings from another world, but whether it did or not, the present house renumbered, I am told, is absolutely free from any such phenomena. One of the most widely known and hair-raising versions of the hauntings of the old house is this: one night, in the 70s of the last century, 2 sailors found themselves stranded in London. Having spent all their pay in riotous living, they were now penniless, and since they knew no one, they were both friendless and homeless too. It was a none too pleasant situation, they told themselves, especially on a night in midwinter. After wandering about disconsolately for some hours, they strolled into Berkeley Square. Then, one of them, seeing to be sold or let at No. was seized with an inspiration. "I say, Bill," he remarked to his mate, "why not get in there? It will be better at any rate than sleeping out of doors." Bill agreed, and after a look round to see no policeman was about, they descended into the area of the house and examined the doors and windows. The latter were strongly barred, but a few mighty shoves, they were both hefty men, against a door eventually forced it open. They groped their way in the pitch dark till they bumped up against a staircase. One of them then struck a match. He had not done so before, for fear of being seen from the street, and they took stock of their surroundings. They were in a stone passage, at the foot of the staircase leading to the first floor. "Better upstairs," Bill commented, "it smells damp down there." "Oozes that ave stayed empty a while always do smell damp, Mick," the other sailor responded. "Suppose we look around air for some wood or summat to light a fire with, and then make for one of the back rooms upstairs." Bill agreed. Being handy men, they soon obtained wood, by the simple process of breaking up several of the kitchen dresser drawers and removing some of the skirting boards. Some loose wallpaper likewise came in useful. Armed thus with requisites, they made their way, as lightly as possible, upstairs, and after a hasty survey of several rooms, finally decided on a back one on the second floor. Endowed with that something which usually characterizes sailors, particularly British sailors, and enables them to overcome the most stupendous difficulties, it did not take Bill and Mick long to make a fire in the small, rusty grate, despite the dampness of the long disused chimney. What with the ruddy flames, crackling wood, and steadily increasing heat, the spirits of the tired tars soon revived, and though they were hungry, a few sips of rum satisfied them tolerably well and made them feel fairly comfortable inside. "Better than the streets or park, Bill?" Mick observed, extracting a plug of tobacco from his pocket and wedging it with a grimy thumb in his pipe. Bill gave a grunt, taken by his companion for acquiescence, and puffed away in silence. "Funny," he ejaculated, after some minutes, "why some oozes won't let and stand empty for so long. I wonder what's the matter with this one." "Why should anything be the matter with it?" Mick rejoined. "There's more oozes than people what can afford to take, that's usually the trouble." "Maybe," Bill grunted, "and maybe not. I ave heard that oozes where murders or suicides ave occurred in lie idle for years. Superstition, I reckon." "That's about it," Mick said. "Surprising how sleepy a fire makes one." After this both men relapsed into silence. Then, after a while, came the sound of heavy, steady breathing. They were both asleep, fast asleep. Bill was the first to wake. A noise somewhere in the house disturbed him. He sat up shivering. The fire had burned very low and the air felt chilly. Fortunately they had laid in a good stock of wood, and in a few minutes there was once again a cheery glow. It was pitch dark outside, not the vestige of a moon, and a wind, blowing from the east or northeast, howled and moaned fitfully down the chimney and round the housetops. Bill took another sip of rum and was about to spread himself out on the floor again, when he heard another sound somewhere in the house. It was like the banging of a door, and seemed to proceed from the basement. "It must be that blamed door we got in at," he said to himself, "yet I thought I made it secure enough. It's the cursed wind. Well, let it bang. I'm damned if I'm going down there in the cold and dark to fasten it." His fidgeting about woke Mick. "What's up, Bill?" he muttered. "Be the Russians boarding us?" The Great War with Russia scare was then at its height, and also the popularity of that old-fashioned music hall ditty, "We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do," which was played by every barrel organ in London. "No, you blamed fool," Bill snapped. "It's the B door we got in by banging." "Better go down and shut it, then," Mick observed, "or some bobby will see it and nab us air." "I'm damned if I'm going down," Bill growled. "What, leave this air fire and light and wander down them stairs in the dark?" "Not me." "Nor me," Mick said. "So let the coppers come, dozens of 'em, for all I care. They can't say much to us for taking shelter on a night like this. and demolishing the kitchen dressers and skirting boards, Bill chuckled. It will cost the knobs that take the Suze a quid or two to replace 'em. Hell. Mick grunted. What's a quid or two to knobs? He was about to add something decidedly uncomplimentary to the wealthy classes, when another noise, outside the room, cut him short. It was a footstep, to be followed immediately by another, and yet another. Did you hear that? He whispered. Someone's below. Both men sat up, all attentive now, and listened. Footsteps were coming up the staircase, and there was something about them that puzzled the two sailors. They were soft and cautious, and gave the listeners the impression they were either muffled, or produced by someone without shoes or boots, in socks, or just bare feet. Every now and then they halted, as if the person, whoever he was, were listening. Then they came on again. And periodically the staircase creaked. Neither man spoke, but involuntarily they edged nearer to one another and shivered. By and by the footsteps came onto the landing and paused again. The sailors held their breaths and listened fearfully. Then, suddenly, Bill sneezed. Amid the stillness of the house it sounded like a miniature explosion. Mick opened his mouth to curse, but the words froze in his throat. There was something about those halting footsteps outside that thrilled all speech and action out of him. He had never experienced the like of them before. He sat quite still, staring at the door, and Bill did the same. After a very brief interval, the steps began again, and, to Bill and Mick's consternation, they came towards the room they were in, soft, stealthy steps, more like those of some great animal than of a human being. Outside the room door they halted, and again Bill and Mick got the impression someone or something was there listening very intently. Then, in the flickering uncertain light from the fire, they saw the door handle slowly begin to turn, inch by inch it opened, wider and wider, and presently they saw a shape, a thing so fantastic and indescribably horrible that they sprang to their feet in a paroxysm of terror. As it entered, creeping furtively towards Mick, Bill darted past it through the doorway out onto the landing. He heard Mick scream, but he was too obsessed with terror to think of going to his assistance. With one hand clutching the banisters, he got down the staircase somehow and out in the street. Then he broke down, and a policeman found him, some time later, lying on the pavement in a swoon. On hearing his tale, the policeman, accompanied by several other members of the force, entered No. and eventually discovered Mick lying in the backyard. He had, apparently, jumped from the window of the room in which he and Bill had slept, and broken his neck. The policeman being, or pretending to be, skeptics where the superphysical was concerned, scoffed at Bill's story and marched him off to the police station. What happened to him subsequently the narrators of this story do not say, for with his capture by the police their narrative ends. A house in Jones Street, close to Berkeley House, is haunted by some influence that tempts people to drink. I gathered from a former servant that nothing ghostly is seen there, but that people staying in the house for any length of time, no matter how abstemious they may have been before, invariably become obsessed with a mania for drink. The house has, in fact, seen a whole series of drunkard tenants. Then there is the strangling ghost of Piccadilly. Much has been written about this case, but no two accounts of it would seem to tally. The version I heard, when the haunting was first spoken about, is this: a lady, living in a flat over a shop in Piccadilly, one night awoke with a start, to see her bedroom door open and a tall woman, with a very evil face, enter. The woman came up to the bed, and seizing the lady by her throat, with cold, bony fingers, commenced strangling her. Eventually the lady lost consciousness. When she came to, she was alone in the room. Hardly able to decide whether her experience was real or simply a nightmare, she decided to spend another night in the same room, taking care, however, this time to lock her door before getting into bed. She awoke with a start, at about the same hour as on the previous night, to hear the door open again, despite the fact she had locked it, and see the same dreadful woman come stealthily towards her. Once again did the cold, bony fingers grip her neck, and once again did she undergo all the sensations of slow strangulation, finally losing consciousness. On recovering this time, she was convinced the room was haunted, and on the morrow she vacated it. It was thus, I was told, that the flat acquired the reputation for being ghost-ridden. There were vague rumors current that some woman had been found dead in her bed, in the flat, under circumstances that suggested foul play, and as either her servant or a hospital nurse who was attending her was suspected, there existed, it was thought by some, an obvious explanation of the haunting. Hearing the flat was to be let and that no one would stay in it for long, I went to see it, hoping to obtain permission to spend a night there. However, on my asking the landlord if it were true that the flat was haunted, he was very wroth. "It's a pure fabrication," he said, "on the part of a lady whom I had to eject for being backward with her rent. She made up this story out of spite." And thus my investigation ended. For some years after this the flat remained empty, but as it is now let, and there is no complaint, so I understand, of a haunting from the present tenant, I conclude that the ghost has either turned over a new leaf and given up its strangling habits altogether, or is away on holiday. A no less harrowing haunting was experienced at one time in a house in St. James's Street. Like No. Berkeley Square, this particular house in St. James's Street long stood empty. Tenants complained of eerie footsteps perambulating the stairs and passages at night, of rappings and hangings, sighing, and diabolical laughter. Forms were seen, too, figures with white evil faces used to open the door of a certain room, no matter whether the door was locked or not, and frighten the inmates by peering at them in bed, and, worse still, every now and then, an invisible something would enter this room, accompanied by a ghastly smell. This was the most terrible of all the phenomena. As in the case of the Berkeley Square house, innumerable stories regarding this house were in circulation. Some seem to be fairly authentic, while the authenticity of others is dubious. One of these stories, quoted by Mr. Ingram one and therefore, perhaps, to be taken as more or less authentic, is as follows: during the course of repairs being done to the house, the builder responsible for them, in the temporary absence of his men, went to see how far the work had proceeded, and was ascending one of the staircases, when he heard footsteps just behind him. He looked round. No one was there. He went on, and the same thing happened. He heard footsteps behind him, just as if someone was following him. Still no one to be seen. Somewhat mystified, but thinking that the sounds, possibly, were due to the acoustic properties of the house, he went into a room where a fire was burning cheerily in the hearth, and dragging a chair across the floor towards it, banged it down purposely with considerable violence, and then seated himself in it. To his amazement, all these actions were imitated by some invisible presence. When he heard the presence slam down a chair close to his and then seat itself on it, his fortitude gave way, and he ran out of the room and house in a panic. My reference in the foregoing case to footsteps, by the way, footsteps are very common phenomena in hauntings, reminds me of an experience I once had in a haunted house in Red Lion Square. It was during the early stages of the Great War. In order to be near the postal censorship headquarters in Kingsway, my wife and I, shared a maisonette with an actress friend of ours in one of the quaint old houses in Red Lion Square. The maisonette was on the third and fourth floors of the house, the ground floor, first and second floors being let as offices. The basement was occupied by a caretaker and his family. During our stay there, nothing of a ghostly nature happened, as far as I know, till one day when I was left in our quarters alone, my wife and our friend and her maid having all gone into the country for a few days. It was on a Saturday afternoon, and I was in my bedroom resting, when I heard heavy, ponderous footsteps slowly ascending the staircase. They came right up to the landing immediately beneath me. I was on the top floor, and halted. Thinking it was the postman, though he generally left the letters on the ground floor, or a tradesman, I went out onto the landing and looked over the banisters, which commanded a full view of the staircase. No one was to be seen. While I was still standing there, looking and wondering, the footsteps began to descend the stairs. I then started off in pursuit, and kept just behind them, all the way down to the ground floor and hall door, which I saw opened by some invisible agency and then shut. When this happened, I realized that the footsteps could only have been due to some denizen from the other world. The impression I got when I followed them down the stairs, only a step or two behind, was that they were produced by some very old person, and this conception received some confirmation, as I will show later on. I did not hear the steps again, but on my mentioning the incident to our actress friend, on her return, she said she and other people had often experienced them, and it was well known in the square that the house bore the reputation of being haunted. My wife, descending the staircase one evening, to post a letter, heard a heavy object fall, with a loud thud, just behind her. It sounded like a human body. She was so startled that she ran down the rest of the stairs as fast as she could, and dared not reascend the staircase alone. When she did so, some minutes later, with our friend, who had returned from the theater, nothing was found that could in any way account for the noise. I questioned the caretaker and his family about the house, and the eldest daughter told me she had on several occasions seen an old man, with a long, white beard, on the staircase and also peeping at her through various doorways. He always vanished, in an inexplicable fashion, if she spoke or attempted to approach him. There were rumors of some tragedy having happened in the house many years previously, but I have not been able to find any authentic record regarding the same. 2 or 3 years after we left the house, the late Duke of Newcastle, who was interested in psychical research, though greatly opposed to what is popularly termed spiritualism, asked me to try to obtain permission from the occupiers of the maisonette we had vacated, to hold a nocturnal vigil there. The occupants proved to be 2 ladies, and they refused me permission, on the grounds that the landlord of the house, being greatly annoyed at the rumors he had heard of its being haunted, had threatened anyone encouraging or spreading such rumors with an action for slander of title. After a little persuasion, however, I prevailed upon them to admit that they had often heard ghostly footsteps and other sounds on the staircase and landings, and that on one occasion a friend of theirs had seen the ghost. They were having a small party one evening, and footsteps being heard ascending the staircase, one of the guests, a young man, went out onto the landing to see who was there. It was an old man with a white beard. He was then in the act of descending the stairs, and on the guest asking him if he wanted to see anyone, he replied, "Oh, it's all right," and went on. Something unusual about the old man induced the guest to follow him right down into the hall and to within a few feet of the front door, where he suddenly and inexplicably disappeared. The youthful guest then realized that he had seen a ghost. It has been suggested that the old man was not a phantom of the dead at all, but a phantom or projection of some person alive at the time, possibly a former occupant of the house, who continually thought of it, picturing it in his mind so vividly that on certain occasions, when conditions were favorable, projection had taken place, that is to say, his immaterial self or ego had detached itself from his material body and actually visited the spot he was visualizing. Such an explanation may appear wild and improbable to many people, but it would seem to be the most, if not the only, feasible explanation in some well-known instances of hauntings. Whether it is the true explanation of the haunting in this particular house in Red Lion Square I cannot say, but I incline to the belief that it is not, and that the phenomena there are due to an altogether different cause.